Winter, 1883, North Fork Signal Station, where a blizzard can bury a man before he ever gets the chance to scream. She'd dragged him out of the snow herself, rope biting her waist, fingers long past feeling. And the moment he came to, his revolver was already in her face. "Who the hell are you?" Voice raw, eyes barely open. She didn't answer with words. She picked up her slate, wrote 2, then pressed his gun barrel aside with her bare palm slow. No fear, like she'd done it 100 times before. This is the story of a woman with no voice, and the one secret she carries that could save an entire town. Stay for what she chooses. The wind had been screaming since noon. Mara Voss had learned, in 3 winters alone at the North Fork Signal Station, that a blizzard had its own kind of grammar. First the temperature dropped fast, almost angry. Then the wind went flat and quiet, for maybe 10 minutes, the worst 10 minutes. The ones that fooled travelers into thinking the storm had passed. Then it came back twice as loud and twice as mean, and it didn't quit until it was good and ready. She was on her second cup of coffee when she heard the bell. Not the rhythm she knew, not the slow, even clang of wind catching the rope at a steady angle. This was ragged, urgent, like something alive had gotten tangled in it. Mara set the cup down and went to the window. She couldn't see more than 10 feet past the glass, just white, just the storm eating everything past the porch rail. But she pressed her face close and waited, and that was when she saw it, a dark shape low to the ground, struggling. Then a larger shadow behind it, slumped and half buried in the drift. A horse and a man. She didn't think much after that. She pulled on her coat, looped a rope around her waist, and tied the other end to the porch post with 2 half hitches and a backup knot. Her father had taught her that. Always a backup knot, Mara. You only need the rope to fail once. The cold hit her like a door swinging open on nothing. She bent her head down and moved toward the shapes. The horse was a big bay, dark with sweat gone cold against its hide. One foreleg had caught a trail marker. Someone had driven it deep into the drift at a wrong angle, and the animal had come down hard, trying to clear it. The leg wasn't broken, but it was bleeding, and the horse was panicked and exhausted in equal measure. Mara got her hand on its neck first, steady pressure, and made herself breathe slow and loud enough for it to feel. Easy, easy now. The man behind it was another problem. He was on his back in the snow, one arm folded under him at a bad angle. And when she crouched down, she could see his lips were pale, and his chest was moving too shallow. There was a dark stain spreading along his right side through his coat. Not fresh, it had been soaking for a while. She grabbed his arm and pulled. He was heavy. She dug her heels in and leaned back against the rope and pulled again. And by the time she got him to the porch, she'd stopped feeling her fingers. Getting them both through the door took longer than it should have. The horse didn't want to come inside. Mara couldn't blame it. But she didn't have a barn close enough in this wind, and the animal would freeze before morning if she left it out. She ended up backing through the door herself, keeping her hand on the bay's nose, coaxing it forward one step at a time until all 4 hooves were on the plank floor and the door could swing shut behind them. She spread 2 horse blankets on the floor near the stove and got the man onto them. He was young, late 20s maybe. Hard jaw, dark hair plastered to his forehead. His hands were so numb she could see it. The skin had gone that particular pale gray color that meant frostbite, was thinking about settling in. She pulled his boots off and started working on the wound, which turned out to be a deep cut along his ribs rather than a bullet hole. Something sharp and forceful. A broken piece of the trail marker, maybe. When his horse went down, she cleaned it, stitched it. 8 stitches, tight and even, the way Dr. Hale had taught her. Then she wrapped him in every spare blanket she had and put a heated flat iron, wrapped in flannel, near his feet. The horse she tended next, cleaned the leg, wrapped it, gave it water, and half a bucket of oats. It stood quietly near the wall and watched her work with big brown eyes that had mostly stopped rolling. The man came around about an hour later, She was feeding wood to the stove when she heard him move. By the time she turned, he was halfway upright, one hand already reaching for his hip. His revolver cleared leather before his eyes were fully open. Mara crossed the room in 3 steps and pushed the barrel to the side with her palm. Firm, not frantic. She kept her eyes on his and waited for him to catch up with where he was. He blinked, looked at the stove, the horse blankets, the bay standing near the far wall, then back at her. She picked up her slate from the table and wrote 2 words, North Fork. He stared at the slate for a moment. Then he let out a long breath and lowered the gun to the floor. Signal station, he said. His voice was rough, dry. I came off the main road somewhere back. She nodded and wrote again. The trail marker was turned wrong. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. He studied her face. Then he looked at the slate, then back at her mouth. You're? He stopped, rearranged whatever he'd been about to say. You're the one who runs this station. She nodded. You pulled me in here yourself? Another nod. He didn't say anything to that for a moment, just accepted it, the way a person accepts weather. He tried to sit up straighter and went slightly gray from the effort, and Mara put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down. She poured a cup of broth from the pot on the stove and handed it to him. He took it without arguing, which told her the pain was worse than he was showing. She was refilling the water basin when she spotted it. His coat had fallen open when she moved him earlier, and the compass was sitting half out of his shirt, pocket iron, scratched from long use, with a small chain soldered to the top. She could see the initials from where she stood, OC. She went still. She knew that compass. She had seen it 3 years ago, in a man's hand, on a mountain road in February, right before the world came apart. She was still staring when he spoke. Something wrong? She pulled her gaze up to his face. He was watching her. She crossed to her slate and wrote a name. Owen Calder. The man's whole body changed. Not a flinch, something deeper than that. He looked at the compass, then at her, and his voice came out quieter. Where did you hear that name? Before she could answer, she saw it through the station window. 3 lantern lights moving fast through the storm, coming from the direction of the main road. He saw her face and turned to look. They're not here to help, he said. He wasn't asking. She could tell by the way he'd already reached for his revolver again, already calculating the angles of the room with the kind of eyes that had done that in other places before. Mara went to the window and counted the lights. 3 horses, armed men. She had seen 2 of them once before, standing outside Vale's freight office in Mercy Gap, pretending to be idle. She picked up the slate. How did they find you here? They didn't find me. He was watching the lights get closer. They steered me here. The directions I was given brought me down that abandoned trail. Someone wanted me separated from my horses. He paused. I accepted a delivery contract. Brought a herd up through the pass. The agent who hired me I didn't know until I was already on the wrong road that he worked for the man I've been looking for. She studied him. Then she wrote, What do they want? His jaw tightened. He looked at the compass. This, he said. She gave herself about 3 seconds to think it through. Then she made her decision. The storage chamber beneath the floor ran the full length of the south wall. She used it for lamp, oil, extra rope, and the older weather journals. Low ceiling, but long. Enough air, enough room. She lifted the hatch and looked at him. He understood what she was offering. He also understood what it would cost her to stand at that door alone. He held the revolver out to her, handle first. She looked at it. I'm not leaving you to face them unarmed, he said. She took it. He lowered himself into the chamber, careful of his ribs, and she was reaching for the hatch when she saw it. The lantern light from outside fell through the east window at a low angle and caught the inside curve of the cracked copper bell hanging near the door. She had never looked at it from this exact position before, in this particular light. Names had been carved into the metal, small, careful letters, a long list of them. She had always known about the list the bell had been made to hold the names of the dead. She just had never stood here at this angle and read them in order. Her eyes found the last line. She went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Owen called her, he tried to warn us. She looked down into the chamber. Rafe was looking up at her, and she could see in his face that he had read it too. The men outside reached the porch. She closed the hatch. The pounding started before she'd taken 3 steps from the hatch. Open up. Official company business. Mara smoothed her coat, picked up the lantern from the table, and went to the door. She opened it 6 inches, no more. The man in front was broad-shouldered and carrying a rifle across his forearm, like it was something he'd forgotten he was holding. 2 others stood behind him in the snow. All 3 had Vale's company mark on their coat buttons a small stamped V that she'd learned to recognize the hard way. The broad man looked past her into the room. We're tracking a horse thief. Dangerous man, stole company property, and fled this direction. You see anyone come through? Mara kept her expression neutral and shook her head. Mind if we look around? She stepped into the doorframe and didn't move aside. The man's eyes traveled the room over her shoulder. She watched him clock the stove, the blankets on the floor, the bay horse standing near the far wall. His gaze stopped on a dark stain near the leg of the stove. She didn't wait for him to ask. She pointed to the bay's wrapped foreleg. He squinted at it, then at her. You live out here alone? She nodded. Can't you talk? She picked up the slate from beside the door and wrote, Injury from childhood. I manage fine. He read it and grunted, like her answer was an inconvenience. The man behind him whispered something and pointed toward the eastern side of the station. Mara had already planned for this. She moved past them onto the porch, set the lantern on the rail, and angled it so the blue glass panel caught the wind, throwing a cold blue wash of light toward the ravine road. The broad man went still. That a signal? She wrote, Someone moving fast toward the ravine. 10 minutes ago, I didn't know what to make of it. She watched him decide. He wanted to believe her because it was easier than forcing his way inside a signal station and making a record of it. Vale had taught them to stay quiet when they could. We'll check the ravine, he said. He looked at her one more time, long and flat. You see anything else? You send word to the freight office in Mercy Gap. She nodded, like she would. She watched the lantern lights move east until they disappeared into the storm. Then she counted to 60 before she went back inside, crossed to the south wall, and knocked twice on the floor. The hatch opened. Rafe came up slowly, favoring his right side. She could see the effort it cost him, and she didn't comment on it, just moved to the stove and poured more broth. He straightened up and looked at her. They asked about the compass. She hadn't expected him to lead with that. She'd heard it through the floor, the careful, sideways questions about whether she'd found any property near the trail, whether the man had been carrying a case or a pack, whether any metalwork had come loose in the snow. She sat down at the table and picked up her slate. Yes, they asked for it without naming it. Someone sent me down that trail on purpose. He sat across from her, moving carefully. The directions came through a freight agent in Billings. I didn't make the connection until I was already 3 miles off the main road. He looked at the copper bell without expression. How long have those names been carved there, she wrote. The community made the bell after the avalanche, 3 years ago. Owen was my brother. She wrote, I know. He looked up from the slate. How he saved my life. He pushed me into a stone hollow before the second wave came. I was one of the survivors. Silence. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the storm hadn't slowed at all. Rafe looked at the table. She could see him working through it, the timeline, the distance, the fact that she had recognized the compass immediately and said nothing. When he finally raised his eyes, there was no anger in them yet. Just something heavy. Did you know who caused it? She held his gaze, then she wrote, Yes. Then tell me. She shook her head. His jaw tightened. Mara, she wrote fast, because you will go after him and you will die. And then there will be 2 of you on that bell. He sat back. He didn't like it, but he stopped pressing. She told him what she would give him. Owen hadn't caused the avalanche. He hadn't been drunk, hadn't been careless, hadn't led the caravan onto the wrong trail. He had found something on that mountain, and he had tried to stop it. What Mara had seen, and who had done it, she kept to herself. Not because she didn't trust him, because trust and safety were two different things. Rafe was quiet for a long time. Then I took the contract because the route came through this area. I wanted to find you. He turned the compass over in his hands. I'd been looking for 3 years. Owen's name was cleared officially, but no one could explain how he ended up where he did. The freight company called it an error in judgment. Something crossed his face. Owen didn't make errors in judgment. She believed that. She had seen it in the 40 seconds she'd spent near Owen Calder before the world came apart, the way he'd moved, deliberate and sure, the way he'd looked at her when he pushed her toward that hollow. He had not been panicking. He had been choosing. She wrote. He wasn't. Rafe nodded once, like that settled something he'd been carrying for a long time. They worked through the rest of the night without much talk. By morning, the storm had pulled back to a low, steady wind. They went out together and reset the trail markers someone had turned. She held the post while he drove it back into the frozen ground. Both of them cold enough that the work went fast, because standing still was worse. Over the signal post, she explained, through the slate and a few practice signs, why she couldn't leave North Fork. The spring thaw was 3 weeks out. Travelers would come through Dead Woman Pass, whether conditions were safe or not, and the station was the only warning system on this stretch of mountain road. She'd been the only one running it since her father died. He listened to all of it. I have to deliver the surviving horses and send a telegram from Mercy Gap. Public record of where I've been. He glanced toward the road. If I disappear quietly, no one comes looking. If I sign a telegraph record and file a complaint against the company's agent for the false directions, there's a paper trail. She understood. Vale couldn't make him disappear if too many people knew he was alive and already talking. They worked out a lantern code. Simple. East window lit at dusk meant she was well. 2 lights meant trouble nearby. No light meant emergency. Before he saddled his horse, he turned to her. I'll come back when the mountain road's open. She didn't answer that. He stood there a moment, then gave a short nod and rode out. She stood on the porch until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went inside, opened her weather journal to the current date, and wrote the number 43 in the margin. 43 days until the mountain roads typically opened. She didn't call it waiting, she called it record-keeping. In the morning, she found the torn page. It had been pulled cleanly from the binding, not ripped in anger, but removed with patience, the way a person takes what they came for. The measurements from the ridge above Mercy Gap were gone. She found the windowsill next. Black mud and something blue powder residue, fine as dust, smeared along the wood where someone had pressed a gloved hand. She stood at the window for a long time, looking at the mountain. Someone had been in her home while she slept, and they knew exactly what they had come for. 6 weeks later, the river tried to kill a schoolteacher. Mara had been watching the upstream channel since mid-morning. Something in the sound of the water was off, too fast, too loud for what the temperature should have produced overnight. She'd checked the benchmarks her father had cut into the boulder on the east bank. The waterline had climbed 4 inches since dawn. She was already on her horse when the wagon came into view below, stuck sideways on a gravel bar with the current pulling hard at its wheels. A woman in the driver's seat was fighting to hold 2 horses steady. Behind her, crates of books and supplies were sliding toward the downstream side. Mara read the situation in about 3 seconds. An ice shelf had let go somewhere upstream. The bar would be underwater inside 20 minutes. She turned her horse toward the high point on the south bank and pulled her signal mirror from her coat pocket. 3 flashes toward Mercy Gap, then 3 more. Then she rode into the river. The current hit her horse sideways, and the animal lurched, but it found its footing on the gravel and pushed through. She got to the wagon, got a rope on the axle, and pulled. The wagon didn't move. The river bottom was soft, and the wheels had sunk. She was about to try a different angle when she heard hoofbeats on the north bank. Two horses came down, fast, big, well-matched animals that knew water. Crossing the channel like it was a minor inconvenience. The man riding the lead horse had a second rope already coiled in his hand. Rafe called her. 6 weeks and 2 days after he rode away in a blizzard. He didn't say anything. He read the situation the same way she had, fast and practical, and positioned his horses upstream of the wagon so the current pressed their pull in the right direction instead of fighting it. He threw her the second rope, she got it tied, and between the four horses they broke the wheels free and dragged the wagon onto solid ground in under 2 minutes. The teacher climbed down shaking. Lord in heaven, thank you, both of you. Rafe had dismounted and was checking the wagon wheels for damage. He glanced up the woman. River should be passable again by late afternoon. Stay on high ground until then. Mara had gotten down from her horse and was checking the rope burn on her saddle horn. She heard boots on gravel and looked up. Rafe stopped a few feet away. The blizzard had cut his face that night in February, left shadows under his eyes. He looked better now, healed, rested, but careful, like he'd been thinking about what to say and couldn't decide if any of it was right. He said, "The bay is fine, in case you were wondering. Leg healed clean." She raised an eyebrow. She had been wondering. He reached into his saddlebag and started pulling things out. Lamp oil. 2 paper packages of medicine, she recognized the labels. A bag of seed she'd mentioned, running low on 3 winters back, which meant he'd been paying attention to something she'd written in passing. A box of metalwork, and when she opened it, she found the fittings for the copper bells rope bracket, which had been cracked since January. "I sent a telegraph complaint against the freight agent," he said, "filed it in Billings, and copied it to the territorial office. Signed my name and the date." He put his hat back on. "There's a paper record now." She picked up her slate and wrote, "Did they try to stop you?" "Someone broke into my room in Billings the night before I filed. Didn't find anything useful." He looked at the mountain behind the station. "I told my contractor in Oregon I needed more time." He wasn't happy. He paused. "I'm going to stay through the thaw, if that's agreeable." She studied him for a moment. Then she wrote, "You came back to ask about Owen. I came back because I said I would." He met her eyes steadily. "The questions about Owen are still there, but they're not the reason I'm standing on this riverbank." She wasn't sure she believed that yet, but she wrote, "The roof needs work," and turned toward the station. He got his horses, settled in the lean-to, and climbed onto the roof without being asked. She listened to him work while she updated her weather records. He didn't press her for conversation. He fixed the damaged shingles, came down when he was done, and started on the warning lantern mounting without being told that was next. She brought him coffee. She made biscuits for supper, and he managed to burn his batch somehow, which shouldn't have been possible on a cast iron stove, and she laughed before she could stop herself. A silent laugh, shoulders shaking, which made him look at her, with something caught between embarrassment and relief, like he'd needed to see her laugh more than he'd realized. She put his biscuits out for the birds and didn't comment on it. He slept in the station that night. She made up the cot near the east wall, which was warmer than the barn and better than the floor. She didn't tell him that she'd thought about putting the cot there about 2 weeks ago, just in case. In the morning, Lucan Price arrived, Vale's man. Polite the way a warning is polite, all surface courtesy, and something underneath it that didn't match. He offered Mara a number that was more than she made in a year to guide a freight train through Dead Woman Pass. She wrote no and handed the slate back without looking at him. Lucan's eyes moved to Rafe. Something passed across his face, recognition, or calculation, or both. He left without pushing the matter. After he rode away, Mara and Rafe went up to the ridge, together. She brought her records. He brought Owen's compass. She showed him what she'd charted over 3 winters, the hollow sections, the runoff channels, the places where loaded wagons would punch through spring snow and not come back up. He listened without interrupting. He asked two careful questions about the notation system, understood her answers, and didn't ask her to explain twice. Then she saw the drill holes. They were fresh, half buried under the week's melt. But the edges were too clean for anything natural. She crouched and looked without touching. Blue cord, the same color as the residue on her windowsill, was still threaded through the nearest one. She looked at Rafe. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, but they both understood that whoever had taken that page from her journal hadn't done it for reading material. They rode back to the station in silence, and Mara rebuilt the fire, and neither of them slept especially well. She woke to an empty station, not unusual on its own. Rafe had been waking early, checking the horses, sometimes walking the lower ridge before breakfast. But his saddlebag was gone, and Owen's compass was not on the shelf where he'd left it the night before. Mara stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she pulled on her coat and went to saddle her horse. She found his tracks in the soft mud above the tree line and followed them northeast, toward the old avalanche slope. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of spring morning that looks gentle and isn't. Snow on the north faces was still deep. The south faces had been melting for 2 weeks, which meant the ground underneath was saturated and unstable. She knew this mountain. She had 3 years of records, proving exactly what it did and when. She found Rafe crouched at the base of a long rock outcropping, the compass open in his palm, comparing the scratched bearings to the terrain in front of him. He'd found the drill holes, a line of them, older than the ones she'd spotted yesterday, positioned in a precise arc along the base of a snow shelf. She could see from 30 feet away that he'd been there a while. He'd cleared snow from several of them with his boot. She dismounted and walked toward him, and he heard her coming and stood up. Mara. She held up a hand. She didn't need the slate for this. She pointed at him, pointed at the ground where he stood, and shook her head hard. I found exactly what Owen marked, he said. These holes are old 3 years at least. Someone drilled them before the avalanche. Not after. She looked at the snow shelf above them, then at the saturated ground beneath his boots, then back at him. She pointed upward, pointed at the sun, pointed at the ground. Mimed water pooling. He understood. He just didn't move fast enough. The shelf came down without much warning, a sound like a heavy door closing somewhere above them, then a low concussion through the ground, then a wall of wet snow and broken ice moving faster than it looked. Rafe tried to step back, and his boot punched through the crust into hollow space beneath. He went down sideways. Mara was already running. She had the rescue rope off her saddle and a loop around the old signal stake in the ground before the second wave hit. The stake had been there since her father's time, driven deep into solid rock. She threw the rope toward where Rafe had gone down and felt it go taut almost immediately. She planted her feet and held on. It took everything she had. The snow wanted to pull him sideways toward the ravine, and she was pulling straight back, and for about 20 seconds, neither direction was winning. Then his hand came up through the surface and got the rope, and she leaned back with her whole body weight, and he came out of it slowly, dragging himself along the rope, hand over hand, until he was on solid ground. They both stayed still for a moment, breathing. Then Mara stood up and looked at him, and what was on her face was not relief. Not yet. She picked up her slate from where it had slid from her coat pocket and wrote, pressing hard enough that the letters were deeper than usual. You went alone. You didn't tell me. I would have known that ground was hollow. I know, he said. 3 years of records, 3 winters of watching this mountain, and you went without me like I was something to be managed. He took the slate from her carefully. He read it. He handed it back and didn't defend himself, which was the right choice. You're right. I treated your knowledge like it was optional. She wasn't finished. She wrote, Owen died on this mountain. Don't make me watch someone else do the same thing. On purpose. That one landed. She could see it. I'm sorry, he said. I wanted to see it myself, before I asked you to trust what I was thinking. That was wrong. It's your mountain. It was Owen's mountain. I had no right to come up here, like I was the only one with a stake in it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to her horse. He followed. They rode down in silence. The town of Mercy Gap was having one of Vale's good days. When they came through, there were new supply wagons parked outside the general store and a crew of men repairing the church roof. Vale himself was standing in front of the freight office in a clean coat, talking to three men Mara recognized as mine foremen. Generous with his hands when he talked. Lots of nodding, the kind of public performance that looked like prosperity. He saw Mara, smiled at her the way he always did, warm and patient, and slightly sorry for her, which was its own kind of threat. He excused himself from the foreman and crossed the street. Rafe stiffened slightly beside her but didn't move. Vale stopped at a conversational distance. Mara, good to see you down from the mountain. His eyes moved to Rafe, measured him in about 2 seconds, and moved back. I heard your signal station had some trouble this winter. A stranger who got turned around in the storm. She held his gaze. She'd had 3 years of practice holding Cormac Vale's gaze. He lowered his voice so only she could hear. A woman who cannot speak will have difficulty convincing anyone of much. You know that. Everyone in this valley knows that. He said it pleasantly, like he was telling her something useful. I've always thought your best chance at a comfortable life was to focus on what you're good at. The weather records. The signal work. A brief pause. Leave the rest of it alone. She held the gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned her horse and rode. Rafe caught up to her on the edge of town. He didn't ask what Vale had said. She appreciated that. They were all back to the station when they ran into Lucan Price on the road going the other direction. He pulled his horse to the side and looked at Rafe, with an expression that was doing a lot of work to look neutral. You should know, Lucan said quietly, that there are 2 men watching the North Fork Road, rotation of about 4 hours. He didn't look at Mara. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm telling you because if something happens to either of you, the questions that follow are going to land on people I care about. He started to ride on, then stopped. Vale likes things that look like accidents. Keep that in mind. He rode away before Rafe could respond. That evening, Rafe came to find her where she was updating her records at the table. He sat down across from her and waited until she looked up. I shouldn't have gone up there without you, he said. Not because you needed to protect me, because I didn't have the right to investigate your grief on my own schedule. He set his hands flat on the table. Everything on that mountain belongs to you as much as it belongs to Owen's memory. More, probably. You've been living with it. I've been arriving late and asking questions. She considered him. Then she wrote, Are you going to do it again? No. She studied his face to see if he meant it. He did, or close enough to it. She wrote, Then we can keep working. In the morning, Dr. Hale's horse came back to Mercy Gap without her. Mara heard about it from Eli, who came riding up the North Fork Road at noon with his hat in his hand and his face tight with something between worry and fear. Dr. Hale had been seen the previous evening entering the road toward the old St. Orison mine to treat an injured worker. She hadn't come back. Her horse had been found at the edge of town, with the reins trailing and her medical bag still tied to the saddle, except the bag had been opened and turned partway out, and there was blood on the leather strap. Not a lot of blood, but enough. Mara and Rafe looked at each other across the yard. Lucan's warning was still sitting in the air between them. Vale likes things that look like accidents. Dr. Hale was the only physician within 40 miles. She'd treated Vale's workers all winter. She'd seen their injuries up close: powder burns, rope cuts, the particular damage that came from handling blasting equipment. She'd seen too much. Eli stood in the yard holding his hat and looking at Mara, because in his experience, Mara usually knew what to do. She picked up her slate and wrote one word, tomorrow. Then she went inside to check the rope and signal flares and make sure everything was in order. They were going to the mine. The wagon tracks were deep and fresh. Tomas Reyes found them first, where the main road bent toward the lower canyon. He dropped down from his horse and crouched beside the nearest rut, pressing 2 fingers into the mud. "Loaded heavy," he said. Came through early morning before the frost lifted. He stood and looked toward the canyon mouth. Same mule brands as the freight line that ran these routes 3 years ago. I'd know that shoe pattern anywhere. Mara noted that in her journal without comment. Rafe had ridden quietly since they'd set out at first light. He was watching the ridgeline more than the road, which was the right instinct up here. She'd noticed early on that he had a particular kind of attentiveness in unfamiliar terrain, not nervous, just precise. He cataloged things without announcing it. The St. Orison mine had been abandoned for 6 years. The main shaft entrance was boarded, but the secondary buildings were intact: an assay office, a long equipment shed, and at the back, small and low-roofed, the powder shed they built away from everything else, because that was the first rule of storing explosives: distance. The door had a new lock on it. That was interesting, given the mine had been closed for 6 years. Rafe looked at the lock, then at Mara. She nodded. He had the lock off in about 90 seconds, using a tool from his saddlebag that she didn't ask about. Dr. Hale was inside, sitting on a crate with her coat pulled around her and her expression arranged into something that was determined to be calm, despite obvious evidence of a difficult night. She was unhurt past a bruised wrist and a cut above one ear that had stopped bleeding on its own. "I was wondering how long," she said. She looked at all 3 of them, then at the door behind them. "Is Vale's man still on the road?" "We came through the gully," Tomas said. "Saw one rider about a mile back." "Good." Dr. Hale stood, steadied herself on the crate, and pushed her hair back from her face. "They kept me alive because they still needed someone to treat their workers, and because my disappearance on top of everything else would bring the wrong kind of attention." She looked at Rafe. "You're Owen's brother?" "Yes." She accepted that and moved on. "I need to tell you what I heard," she told them in plain language without pausing to soften it. Vale's old warehouse on the south side of Mercy Gap contained stolen silver from 3 separate mining operations, covered by forged shipping seals and listed as equipment in the company ledgers. The payroll for those same 3 mines, one combined transfer substantial enough to fund a season of operations, was arriving during Founders' Day. The celebration put most of the town in one place. The evacuation routes were predictable. Vale planned to use explosives near the natural ice dam above Mercy Gap, not to destroy the dam. Entirely just enough to produce what would look, from the outside, like a sudden spring flood, a credible disaster. In the confusion, his men would move the payroll. The water would reach the warehouse and take the evidence of the silver theft with it. "He knows people might die," Dr. Hale said. "He's decided that's acceptable." Nobody spoke for a moment. "He needs Mara," Tomas said. Dr. Hale nodded. "He has 1 page of her records. His men have been watching the mountain all winter, trying to reconstruct the routes. But her notation system—" Mara had designed the notation herself, built on a combination of her father's original codes and her own 3 years of additions. It was not something you decoded from a single page. "He needs her to confirm which sections of snow can hold loaded powder wagons, Doctor," Hale said. "Without that, he risks losing his equipment and his men before they reach the dam." Rafe was looking at Mara, not like she was a problem to be solved, like he was reminding himself that she was standing right there in the room. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Founders' Day is in 2 weeks, Tomas said. A sound came from the slope above the mine, not close, but moving closer. Loose rock. Then the sound of something heavy shifting higher up. They got out the side door of the shed just as the mudslide came down the main approach. Not catastrophic, a wet surge of spring runoff pulling debris off the face of the canyon, but it blocked the path they'd come in on completely. Rafe looked at the blocked exit and started toward a support beam that had come down across the side passage. He got his hands under it and lifted, and for a second it moved, and then the weight shifted, and it came back down, and he had to drop it or lose both hands. Mara was already at the mule. There were two of them in the corral behind the equipment shed veils, left to wait, and one of them was older and steadier looking, with the particular patience of an animal that had worked long routes. She went to its head first, got a hand on its neck, and talked to it without words, just breath and pressure, until it stopped pulling against the rope. She backed it toward the beam, got the rope around the timber in two loops, pointed at Rafe to stand clear. The mule leaned into the harness and walked forward, and the beam moved. I could have figured that out, Rafe said. She raised an eyebrow and pointed at his hands. He looked at his palms, which were fair. Tomas was already scouting the alternative route back to the road. They got Dr. Hale onto the steady mule and moved. That night, back at the station, Rafe sat at the table and looked at the compass for a while without opening it. Then he said, I came to Mercy Gap because of Owen. That's true. I won't pretend otherwise. Mara was across from him, her hands folded on the table. I knew you were one of the survivors. I knew Owen had tried to warn the caravan. The rest of it. He set the compass down. I thought if I found you, I'd find whoever was responsible, and then I'd know what to do with 3 years of not knowing what happened to my brother. He looked at her directly. That was my plan. It wasn't a good one. She picked up her slate. Wrote, I knew why you came. From the second night, he nodded slowly. And you let me stay anyway. Someone had to fix the roof. He almost smiled at that. Almost, she wrote. We have 2 weeks. Vale and Owen can wait 2 weeks. You're right, she wrote. We save Mercy Gap first. Then we talk about the rest. He looked at the slate, then at her. Together, he said. She held his gaze a moment and nodded. She didn't plan to fall asleep in the chair. She hadn't intended to close her eyes at all. There was too much to plan. Too many routes to recalculate now that she knew what Vale needed the roads for. But at some point, the fire settled, and the room went warm and quiet. And the next thing she knew, the lamp had burned low, and Rafe was sitting across from her, awake, watching the window. She startled, and he looked over. It's fine, he said quietly. Nothing moved. I've got it. She straightened in the chair and looked at the window, dark and still. Then at him. He'd had his shoulder treated. Dr. Hale had looked at an old injury before they parted ways, something he hadn't mentioned, and he was sitting at an angle that favored it. But his eyes were clear and steady. She relaxed slightly, he said, without looking away from the window. Owen used to say I carried everything like it was my fault it was heavy. He paused. I thought about that a lot this winter. He glanced at her. He probably would have liked you. He had a lot of respect for people who did the work without making noise about it. She didn't respond to that with the slate. She just reached across the table and put her hand over his and left it there. He turned his hand over. Outside, past the dark glass, the mountain held its snow and its silence and its secrets. They were both still awake when the first flames appeared on the North Fork Road. Mara stood up fast and went to the window. Far up the slope, orange light was moving where there shouldn't be any light at all. It grew steadily, and she understood before she wanted to what she was seeing, because she had grown up in that building and she knew its silhouette against the dark. North Fork signal station was burning. They ran for the horses. Through the roar of it, one last time, the cracked copper bell rang once across the valley. Then the tower collapsed and took the bell with it into the fire. The fire had done its work thoroughly. By the time Mara and Rafe reached the station, the roof was gone, and the east wall had folded inward. The signal tower was a pile of burning timber in the yard. Smoke moved across the mountain in a long, low curtain, orange at the bottom, gray above, visible for miles in every direction, which was a bitter kind of irony, given what the station had been built to do. Mara dismounted before her horse fully stopped. Rafe was off his horse a second later, and he caught her arm, not to stop her. He looked at the structure, reading it the way she'd taught him to read snow, looking for which sections had burned longest and which were recent. East wall is gone, he said. West side is still standing. The storage corner might be accessible. She pulled free and went toward the west door, staying low under the smoke. He went with her. The storage corner held. The roof above it had partially collapsed, but the stone foundation had protected the floor, and they got to the box with the lantern codes, 3 of her father's early weather journals, and the copper bell, warped slightly from the heat, but intact, before the remaining roof, gave a sound that meant they had about 30 seconds to be somewhere else. They came out into the yard coughing. Mara stood in the smoke and looked at what was left. 3 years of daily records in the station, gone. The signal equipment, the spare lanterns, the tide markers. Her father had painted himself gone. The new roof shingles Rafe had laid 6 weeks ago. Gone, she turned in a slow circle and assessed what they had. The bell, 3 journals, the lantern code box, the horses, the rope on her saddle. She made herself stop cataloging the losses and start cataloging the resources. Her father had taught her that too. Grief is something you do later. Right now, you count what you have. They rode into Mercy Gap by dawn and found Addie Crane awake and already at her door, because Addie had seen the light on the mountain and had been up ever since. And when she saw their faces, she opened the door wider, without asking a single question. Her boarding house was the largest private building in town. 2 stories, 6 rooms, a kitchen big enough to work in. Addie herself was 60-something and had been through 2 prairie fires, a flood, and a husband who'd liked gambling more than good sense. And she had the particular steadiness of someone who had already survived most of what life could throw. "You'll use the front room," she said, "both of you. Don't argue with me." They didn't. Vale's story was already moving through town by mid-morning. He'd spoken to 3 men before breakfast. Apparently such a shame about the signal station. These old stoves in isolated buildings were a real hazard. He'd always worried about that woman living up there alone. He said it with genuine-sounding concern. He was good at that. Lucan came to the boarding house quietly through the back. He stood in Addie's kitchen with his hat in his hands and looked at the floor rather than at Mara or Rafe. 2 of Vale's guards started the fire, he said. "I know their names. I know which one carried the torch." He stopped. "I'm not testifying to that right now. I can't, but I'm telling you, because you should know it wasn't random." "Why can't you?" Rafe's voice was level, but only just. Lucan's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He left before either of them could push further. By afternoon, a second message arrived. Vale's agent delivered it to the boarding house in person. A formal notice that Rafe Calder's horse delivery contract had been terminated for cause, with a penalty clause Vale's lawyers had apparently been preparing for a while. 12 of Rafe's horses were already in Vale's holding yard, seized as collateral against the penalty. Rafe read the notice twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Mara watched his face. She knew what those horses represented, not just money, but 3 years of careful building, after whatever had brought him to North Fork in the first place. She started to reach for her slate, but he shook his head slightly. "Don't," he said. "I'm all right." He wasn't all right, but he was choosing to function anyway, which she understood. She went to work. By evening, she had the copper bell, hung at the horse camp on the edge of town, where Eli Marsh, 14 years old, quick, and possessed of genuinely extraordinary hearing, had agreed to keep watch on the signal post. Addie had already spoken to the minister about using the church bell. Tomas was taking the mountain road rotation. She drew the colored cloth signals on paper and gave a copy to every household that would take one. It was rougher than the station system. Less range, more variables. But it would function, and functioning was what mattered. Vale came to find her while she was finishing the last signal post placement. He came alone, which was either confidence or a statement. "I wanted to make sure you were settling somewhere comfortable," he said. He looked around at the temporary setup with an expression of polite concern. "I know this is a difficult situation. You've put a lot of years into that station." She met his eyes. "I have a friend in Denver," he said, "a woman who runs a respectable boarding school. She's mentioned needing someone who understands weather and surveying to teach basic navigation. He paused. Safe position. Comfortable. Far from all of this. Another pause. If you signed a statement confirming that the fire was caused by an unattended stove, I could have you on a train to Denver within the week. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the signal post and finished what she was doing. Vale watched her for a few seconds. Then he left. Rafe was waiting near the horse camp when she came back. He'd been watching from a distance far enough to give her the conversation, close enough to see if it went wrong. He offered you a way out, Rafe said. Not a question. She nodded and wrote, Denver, a teaching position, in exchange for signing a statement about the fire. What did you say? She gave him a flat look and pointed at the signal post she'd just finished mounting. He actually smiled at that, brief but real. Then it faded. Mara, you don't have to stay because I lost the contract. What happened to my horses is not your fault, she wrote quickly. North Fork is my home. Vale burned it. Staying is not your decision and it is not his. It's mine. He read it. Something in his posture shifted, not quite relief, but close to it, like he'd been carrying a weight he wasn't sure he had the right to put down. Okay, he said. She wrote, and your presence did not create the danger. Vale did. Stop making that calculation. He looked at the slate for a moment. All right, she underlined the last word she'd written and pointed at him. All right, he said again, more quietly. They were standing close together in the fading light, close enough that she could hear him breathe. He was looking at her with an expression. She didn't quite have a word for not hope exactly, more like someone who had stopped pretending not to want something. She was aware of the distance between them, decreasing slightly. She was aware of him being careful about it, leaving the choice to her, which was the right thing. And then Eli came flying around the corner of the horse camp at a dead run. Mara, Mr. Calder. Tomas is gone, somebody on. The North Road said they saw two of Vale's men and Tomas's horse, and Tomas wasn't in the saddle. They stepped apart, and Mara was already reaching for her slate. Eli skidded to a stop in front of them. Red-faced and out of breath, he thrust out his hand. In it was a strip of cloth red flannel, still damp at one edge, unmistakably from the neckcloth Tomas wore every day. She took it carefully. There was a note tied around it with a piece of wire. She unwrapped it. The handwriting was clean and deliberate. Vale had not written this in anger. He'd written it the way he did everything with patience, and the assumption that he would be obeyed. Mara must guide the wagons through Dead Woman Pass before dawn, or Tomas dies. She read it twice. Then she folded it and looked at Rafe. He was looking back at her with an expression that was working very hard to stay calm. She picked up her slate and wrote one line. Then we have until dawn to build a better plan. She handed Eli the note. Go to Addie. Show her this. Then go straight to your signal post and don't leave it for any reason. She wrote it as she said the words, the way she always did when she needed to be certain. Eli had everything right. He took the note and ran. Rafe looked at the mountain. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, and the light was going gold and thin. He took Tomas because Tomas knows the major turns, Rafe said, but he still needs you for the hollow snow sections, which means Tomas is alive as long as Vale thinks he needs the leverage. She nodded. And the moment he thinks he doesn't need it anymore, she nodded again. Rafe picked up her slate and looked at what she'd written, until dawn, to build a better plan. He handed it back. Then let's start building. They went inside. Mara was packing before full dark. Rope coiled tight. 3 signal flares wrapped in oilcloth. The medicine kit. A day's worth of food in a saddlebag. She worked methodically, laying each item on the table and checking it before it went in, the way her father had taught her to prepare, for any mountain situation, not fast, but correct, because fast and wrong was worse than slow and right. Rafe came through the door from the yard and stopped when he saw the pack. He stood there a moment, then, no. She looked up and pointed at herself, pointed at the door, and made the sign for Tomas, 2 fingers pressed together, which she'd been using all season to mean the two of them, their partnership on the road. I know what you're planning, Ray said. You're going to offer yourself in exchange for Tomas. Pretend to surrender, pretend to cooperate, and hope you can slow Vale down long enough for the rest of us to reach the dam. He crossed his arms. I'm telling you, no. She set down the flare she was wrapping and picked up her slate. You don't have the right to tell me no. He read it. His jaw tightened. You're walking into a wagon full of explosives. Tomas has a family. He has a wife and 2 boys in Mercy Gap. Vale will kill him before morning if I don't go. She wrote fast, pressing hard. And if I don't go, Vale finds another way to the dam, and the whole plan moves up. We lose the town trying to save one person. We can find another way to get Tomas out. Name it. She held the slate up. Tell me a way that doesn't cost Tomas his life tonight. He didn't answer because there wasn't one, and they both knew it. She set the slate down. She looked at him, really looked, the way she rarely let herself, because it made certain things harder to ignore, and she could see that he understood. He just wasn't ready to stop fighting it yet. I should go instead, he said, or with you. She shook her head and wrote, Vale doesn't need you. He'll kill you before the road turns. He needs me to interpret 3 years of records he can't read. She stopped, then added, that is the only thing keeping me safe tonight. My usefulness. He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on it and looked at the wood for a long moment. She let him think. Then she sat across from him and wrote, I need to tell you something about Owen. He looked up. She'd carried it for 3 years. She'd told herself it was to protect him, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. Part of it was that saying it out loud would make it real, in a way she'd been holding off. It had been easier, for a long time, to keep it inside where it was only hers. She wrote slowly, and she let him read each line before she wrote the next. Owen found the explosives. He cut the first fuse. He pushed me into the stone hollow and told me to stay down. She paused. He died shielding me from the second wave. The snow came while he was still standing in the open. She watched Rafe's face. He went very still. Before he pushed me into the hollow, he said something. He made me repeat it back so I would remember it exactly. She wrote it carefully, the way she'd written it in her journal once, and then torn out the page and burned it, because she hadn't been ready to have it exist anywhere outside her memory. Tell Rafe this was my choice. He did not fail me. The room was quiet. Outside, someone's horse moved in the yard, and somewhere down the street, Eli's bell gave a single test ring. Rafe didn't speak for a while. When he did, his voice was rough. 3 years. She nodded. You've had that for 3 years. Yes. Why didn't you? He stopped, rearranged. You knew I was looking for answers. You knew what I thought. Why? Because I knew what you would do with it. She wrote it plainly. You would have come to Mercy Gap and gone after Vale and died before the snow melted. And then Owen died for nothing, because the man he loved most in the world threw his life away on revenge. Rafe looked at the table. She wrote one more line. I was wrong to keep it this long. You deserved to know. I was afraid. He looked up at that. She held his gaze and didn't look away from it, which cost her something. Fear was not something she showed easily. She'd spent 3 years building a life where she didn't have to show it to anyone. He said quietly, Owen brought me here. That's true. But you're the reason I stopped wanting to leave. She looked at him. I know that's not what tonight is about, he said. I know you're packing that bag whether I say it or not. I'm not saying it to change your mind. He reached across the table, not to take her hand, just close enough. I just needed you to know. She reached the rest of the way. After a moment, she pulled back and picked up her slate. We need a plan. Yes, he said. He straightened. The grief was still on his face, but it was moving to the side, making room. Walk me through what you're thinking. She laid it out in sections. She would let Vale believe she was cooperating. She knew enough about harness arrangements and mule commands from watching the freight caravans to create problems in the traces without anyone seeing her do it. She would mark the wagons carrying the most powder with red clay, separate from the smaller wagons she intended to redirect toward the quarry. Rafe listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I follow from a distance." Eli watches the signal post and sends word to Addie and Doctor. "Hail when we pass the Willow Fork Bridge." She nodded and wrote, "Addie and Dr. Hale wait near the Willow Bend downstream. If they see a red flare or hear gunfire near the bridge, they stretch rescue ropes across the current. That's a long way for ropes to hold." Addie owns the heaviest cable in Mercy Gap. She bought it for the freight loading dock. She wrote, "I know because I helped her inventory it last fall." He almost smiled. "And Lucan?" She paused, then wrote, "Lucan is going to make a choice soon. Tonight or tomorrow. I think he already knows which one it is." "What makes you think that?" "Because he keeps telling us things he doesn't have to tell us." Rafe considered that, then nodded. They finalized the details. In the next hour, the flare signal, the position at Willow Fork, the downstream rope plan. Rafe sent Eli to Addie with a written message. Dr. Hale received a second message through the back of the boarding house. When everything was set, the room went quiet. Rafe looked at her. She looked at him. There was nothing useful left to say, and they both knew it. And somehow, that was its own kind of pressure. She crossed the room. She kissed him once, deliberate and clear, and then pulled back far enough to see his face. He looked like someone who had been waiting a long time and hadn't fully believed this moment was real until it arrived. "Come back," he said. She picked up the saddlebag. They rode out together in the dark, and at Willow Fork Bridge the plan came apart. Lucan had warned them. She believed that. But Vale had also been watching Lucan, and somewhere between the boarding house and the bridge, the information had run the wrong direction. The first shot came from the tree line on the north bank. It caught Rafe in the left shoulder. He stayed in the saddle, she saw that. She was watching, but his horse spooked sideways, and the second man was already coming out of the trees, and there were 4 of them at least, moving to cut the road in both directions. Rafe turned his horse to face them. He was putting himself between her and the road south. She understood immediately what he was doing, and she turned back for him, which he had planned not to do, but planning. And the moment of it were 2 different things, and she turned back. Vale's man caught her horse's bridle from the right. She heard Rafe shout not her name, just a sound, sharp and involuntary, and then something hit the back of her saddle, and she was stopped, and it was over in under 30 seconds. The last thing she saw clearly before the wagon came was Rafe going off the bridge. He went into the river, sideways, one arm up, the current taking him. Immediately, she watched the place where he'd gone in. The water was dark and fast, and it didn't give anything back. Downstream in the willows, a red flare went up. Someone had thrown the ropes. She had to believe that. She had to believe Addie and Dr. Hale were in the willows, and the ropes were in the water, and the current would carry him to them. She had to believe it, because Vale's men were closing the wagon door, and she needed every part of her mind for what came next. She pressed her back against the wagon wall and breathed. She counted the seconds and listened to the mules and started memorizing every sound the harness made. Mara woke to the smell of black powder and the sound of mules breathing. She was on her side in the wagon bed, wrists bound behind her with rope that had been tied by someone who knew what they were doing. The wagon was moving. Slow, deliberate. The way loaded wagons moved on mountain roads where a wrong wheel placement meant the difference between arriving and not arriving. She didn't move. She listened. 4 mules on the lead traces, 2 wagons behind this one, judging by the sound. Men on horseback flanking both sides. She counted hoofbeats and came up with 6, maybe 7. Tomas was in the wagon behind her. She'd heard him cough once, then stop, like he was trying not to be heard. He was alive. That was enough to work with. Vale climbed in from the back when the road leveled out and sat across from her, like this was a business meeting. He had that look. He always had patient, organized, slightly sorry for whatever inconvenience the present circumstances were causing. "I have 1 page of your records," he said. "The ridge measurements above Dead Woman Pass. My men have been watching the route for 3 weeks. He set his hands on his knees. But the notation is yours. I can read the numbers. I can't read what the numbers mean. She looked at the wagon wall behind his head. The snow is still hollow in sections, he said. My wagons weigh 11,000 pounds loaded. If I send them down the wrong line and they break through, I lose the powder, the mules, and 6 men. That doesn't work for me. He leaned forward slightly. Guide me through Dead Woman Pass. Keep the wagons on solid ground, and Tomas goes home to his family. She looked at him then, held the look long enough to let him think she was considering it. She was considering something, just not what he thought. She had watched freight caravans move through this territory for 3 years. She knew which mules led and which followed. She knew that the big roan on the left trace was trained to the 2-note whistle Vale's driver used, because she had seen that specific animal and that specific driver on the Mercy Gap Road 4 times since last autumn. She knew that if the lead mule turned, the rest turned with it. She studied the harness arrangement through the gap in the wagon's front panel. The traces connecting the second wagon to the first were clipped with standard freight hooks, fast to attach, fast to detach. If you knew the release point, she had 3 hours until they reached Dead Woman Pass. She started working on the rope at her wrists. Behind her, through the wagon wall, Tomas shifted. She tapped 3 fingers against the wood, once, steady, the signal she and Tomas had used on the road all spring to mean I know what I'm doing. Stay still. She heard him settle. An hour in, Lucan rode up alongside the wagon. She could hear his horse by its particular rhythm. Lucan's mare had a choppy left front stride that was impossible to mistake. He didn't look in, but he slowed until he was even with the gap in the panel, and he said quietly, to no one in particular, the smaller wagon is running last in line. Lighter load, different powder type. Then he rode on. She'd already identified it, but she appreciated the confirmation. Vale was moving up his schedule. She'd understood that the moment they put her in the wagon, this was happening. Before Founder's Day, before the town was fully gathered, before the evacuation routes were blocked. The dam work must be further along than anyone knew. She worked the rope steadily and waited. The rope came free just before the road started climbing. She didn't move her arms. She kept them behind her back and breathed normally and waited until the guard at the front of the wagon turned to speak to the driver. Then she slid her hand along the floor until her fingers found a metal edge, a crate corner, sharp where the wood had split, and she marked it in her memory. When Vale came back an hour later to press her for a decision, she nodded. He looked satisfied. He was good at reading compliance. He wasn't as good at reading the difference between compliance and preparation. She pointed toward the road ahead and held up 4 fingers. 4 turns. She'd guide them through 4 turns, and then they'd reach the ridge, and by then she needed 2 things to happen. The traces on the second and third wagons needed to be loose, and someone needed to be at the quarry. She worked through the night. She palmed red clay from the wagon floor. It had come in on someone's boots from the mountain, and marked the 2 heavy wagons with a stripe along the rear sideboards when the guard's attention was forward. Small, clear, enough to see from 30 feet in good light. She found the lead trace hook on the second wagon connection when they stopped to water the mules, and she was allowed out under watch. She worked it half loose with her thumbnail and the edge of her boot heel and walked back to her wagon without hurrying. Smaller wagon, running last, she left alone. Lucan came to her once, near midnight, when the camp was quiet and the guard had rotated. He crouched at the wagon's back opening and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I helped him. You should know that. Not tonight before. I carried his messages. I watched his men. I knew what happened 3 years ago, and I said nothing. He looked at his hands. I'm not asking you anything. I just wanted to say it out loud to someone who has the right to hear it. She looked at him steadily. His sister, Rafe, had said back in the station when they'd been trying to understand Lucan. She'd thought about that since. She leaned forward and wrote in the dirt between them, with 1 finger. Free Tomas. Signal Eli. Then choose. Lucan looked at what she'd written. Then he stood up and walked back toward the camp. Downstream, in the dark she couldn't see, Addie and Dr. Hale had pulled Rafe from the river. She had to believe that. She had built the plan around it. She was not going to spend the night. She needed to be most precise grieving. A man she didn't know, for certain, was dead. She pressed her back against the wagon wall and listened to the mountain breathe. She heard Rafe's voice in her memory, from the boarding house table, saying, "Owen brought me back. But you're the reason I stopped wanting to leave." And she filed it away. Somewhere she could reach it later. Later she was going to need a later for all of it. At first light, Vale ordered the fuse rigged. She heard him give the order from the front of the caravan. Clean, direct, the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time and was done waiting. The burning fuse began its run toward the ice dam. Down in Mercy Gap, Eli heard something no one else caught. Yet the shift in the mountain's sound. The way the upper ridge had gone quiet in the wrong way, and he ran for the bell. He rang it 3 times fast, then 3 more. In the church below, Addie heard him. She pulled the church bell rope, and the sound went out across the valley, long and clear, and the Founders' Day crowd began to look up. On the ridge above them all, the fuse burned toward morning. The crowd didn't move at first. That was the thing about warning bells. People heard them and looked at each other, waiting for someone else to decide how serious it was. Addie didn't wait for anyone to decide. She came down from the church steps and walked into the middle of the Founders' Day gathering and said, in a voice that carried to both ends of the street, "Up, higher ground." Now, some people moved. Others looked toward Vale's men at the edge of the square, who were not moving, which to some people meant there was nothing to worry about. Dr. Hale pushed through from the south end of the street. She'd come down the mountain on the horse. Rafe's group had brought her, and she was still damp from the river willows, and she did not look like someone who had been overreacting. "The river is rising upstream," she said. "I watched it for 3 hours. Get your children and go up." That moved people. On the ridge, Mara heard the church bell reach the valley and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight all night. Vale heard it too. He swung toward the caravan, and his voice went flat. "Move them, all of them, now." His men pushed the mule teams forward toward the dam. Mara stood up. She had been sitting near the front of the first wagon, supposedly reading her notations for the driver. The guard behind her was watching the road, not her. She reached into her coat and found the whistle she had taken off him 4 hours ago, while he was sleeping, sliding it out of his breast pocket. So slowly, it had taken nearly 10 minutes. She blew 2 notes. The lead mule planted its feet and swung left. It was a good mule. Vale had trained it well, which meant it was loyal to the command that came first and loudest. The 2-note meant left secondary road, the instruction for detour around obstacles, and it had been responding to that command for 3 years. The mule took the secondary road. The traces on the second wagon, the ones she'd worked loose through the night, snapped at the first turn stress. The heavy wagon rolled sideways, listed, and stopped in the gravel basin at the bottom of the secondary slope. The third wagon, connected to the second, stopped behind it. The red-marked wagons, both of them. Most of the powder was off the main road. Vale spun around, and she was already running. She hit the ground and ran for the main fuse line, which was burning through its last 40 yards toward the charges under the ice dam. She could see it, the low fizzing light, moving fast through the morning, and she ran the way she had not run since the night of the avalanche, when she had been 18 years old and the world had been collapsing. And Owen Calder had pushed her into a hollow in the rock. Behind her, Vale was shouting. She heard his boots on the ground coming after her. She reached the fuse and dropped to her knees and found her knife. She cut it. The fizzing stopped. The silence was enormous. She stayed on her knees for 1 second too, waiting to find out if she'd been wrong about how close it was. Nothing happened. The ice dam groaned above her in the morning cold, but it did not move. Vale reached her and grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her up and pressed the gun to her side, and she looked at him with completely steady eyes, and he pulled the hammer back. Then Lucan said, from somewhere behind Vale's left shoulder, he lit the old fuse himself. I was there. I watched him do it. Vale turned. Lucan was standing in the open, which had clearly cost him something. He was not a man built for standing in the open, but he was standing there, and he was talking, and 3 of Vale's workers were close enough to hear him. 3 years ago, Lucan said, I was 20 feet away. He lit the fuse and he walked away, and 20 minutes later, 60 feet of snowpack came down on a caravan of people who had hired his freight company to get them across the mountain safe. One of Vale's workers lowered his rifle. Then another. Vale's grip on Mara's shoulder loosened by 1 degree. She felt it. She stepped sideways and blew the whistle twice more. Vale's horse, the big gray he'd been riding all morning, pulled the powder wagon it was still attached to forward and then sideways, away from Vale's outstretched hand, and the wagon rolled past him, and he was left standing empty. Then Rafe was there. He came down from the quarry road with Tomas and 8 riders at his back, and he looked like someone who had spent the night in a freezing river and then climbed a mountain anyway, which was exactly what he had done. His left arm was in a rough sling. He had mud on his face and someone else's coat over his shoulders, and he looked at Mara across 30 feet of ridge, and his entire body said, "You're alive." Back at him and thought, "Yes, and also, you took long enough." Vale went for the remaining powder wagon. He was going to light it himself, by hand if he had to, and it would not have the placement and the charges necessary to bring the dam down, but it would kill the people on this ridge, and that was apparently enough for him. Rafe stepped into his path. A gunman from Vale's crew fired. The shot grazed Rafe along the side, the same side that had been stitched in February in Mara's station, and he went down to 1 knee. Mara blew the whistle, and the lead mule on the remaining wagon turned hard left, and the wagon rolled away from Vale entirely. Vale stood there with nothing in his hands. His own workers walked toward him, not with weapons out. Just walked toward him the way men walk toward something that needs to be held still until it can be dealt with properly. Tomas confirmed the mule brands from the back of a borrowed horse, clear and deliberate, loud enough for everyone on the ridge to hear. Dr. Hale confirmed the powder burns she'd treated all winter. Lucan gave his account again, twice, once to the workers and once to the man from Billings who had ridden out with Rafe's group and who had the particular look of a territorial official, who was going to have a very long week of paperwork. Above them all, the ice dam groaned and held. At the quarry, water was moving. Rafe's group had opened the spillway, with the smaller powder charge from the wagon Mara had marked separately. The charge Lucan had identified and brought to the right people. The water was flowing into the empty quarry basin in a steady, controlled pour, and the pressure on the dam's downstream face was dropping. Mercy Gap was going to flood its lower streets. Some buildings near the river bend would take water in their doors, but the dam was holding. Owen's compass was in Mara's coat pocket. She had taken it from the supply bag she'd packed the night before, which Vale's men had not searched carefully enough. She held it now and looked at the dam and thought about Owen standing on a mountain road in February. 3 years ago, reading a situation in 30 seconds, making a choice. She thought he would have found the quarry solution elegant, efficient, using what the mountain already had, rather than fighting what the mountain wanted to do. Rafe made it to her side by leaning on Tomas for the last 10 yards, which he was pretending wasn't happening. He stopped next to her and breathed for a moment, and looked at the valley below, where the church bell was still ringing, because Addie kept ringing it until she was certain everyone was where they needed to be. "You cut the fuse," he said. She nodded. "And you stole the man's whistle." She took it out of her pocket and held it up. He looked at it. "When?" She tilted her hand back and forth. "A while ago." He laughed once, short and pained because of his ribs, and then stopped because of his ribs. She looked at the wound along his side, then at his shoulder, then back at his face. He said, "I'm standing." That was true. She supposed it was enough for now. Behind them, Vale was being walked toward the territorial official's horse, and his workers were talking over each other, trying to explain what they'd known. And Tomas was already writing something in his own small journal with the stub of a pencil he kept in his boot. The dam held. Below it, Mercy Gap heard its church bell and understood, finally, that the ringing meant it was over. Mara pressed her hand briefly against Rafe's good arm. Then she walked to where Lucan was standing alone at the edge of the ridge, looking at the valley. She stopped beside him. She did not have her slate. She wrote in the air with her finger, slow enough to be read. "You chose." He looked at his hands. "I should have chosen 3 years ago." She wrote in the air. Again. "Yes, but you chose now. That counts for something." He nodded once and kept looking at the valley. She left him to it. Some things you had to stand in for a while before you could walk away from them. When she got back to Rafe, his legs had given their opinion on the matter, and he was sitting on a rock with his head forward and his eyes closed. She put her hand on his shoulder, and he opened his eyes when he heard her. She pressed her palm to the side of his face. He turned his head slightly and breathed. Just that. She had been holding herself very steady for a very long time. She allowed herself for exactly that moment to stop. Then Dr. Hale arrived with her medical bag, and the moment was over, which was probably right. He was going to need stitches again. Same side. She stood over him while Dr. Hale worked and kept her hand on his good shoulder and watched the valley come back to itself in the morning light. The dam held all day. Rafe woke up in Addie's boarding house, with sunlight crossing the floor, and Mara asleep in the chair beside his bed. She was sitting straight, even in sleep, her coat still on, her slate in her lap. Her head had dropped to one side. There were still traces of red clay on her fingers from the mountain. He watched her for a minute before he moved, because he understood, looking at her, that this was what 3 years looked like from the outside. 3 years of running a signal station alone. 3 years of watching a mountain that had taken everyone she loved. 3 years of keeping a secret that had cost her something every single day. He made a small sound turning over, and she was awake immediately, the way people were awake when they'd never fully stopped listening. She looked at him, then at the window, then back at him. He said, "Still alive?" She wrote on the slate, "Without looking down, Doctor. Hale says you can't ride for several weeks." She told me. Mara added a line. "She told me you already asked about riding to the quarry to check the spillway. She told you that, too." Mara underlined several weeks. He leaned back on the pillow and looked at the ceiling. "Vale, territorial custody." She wrote it out. "Testimony from 5 people, plus the physical evidence. The drill holes, the blasting cord, the compass bearings, the mule brands. The investigation into the old avalanche was going to be reopened. Owen's name was going to be cleared properly, officially, in a written record that would outlast everyone in the room." He was quiet for a while. She waited. She was good at waiting. "He died making a choice," Rafe finally said. "He knew what he was walking into." She wrote, "He knew." "Yes, I spent 3 years thinking I'd failed him." "You didn't." She wrote it plain and set the slate where he could see it. "He made his choice. You honoring it is not the same as failing him." He read it. He nodded slowly, like something was settling rather than arriving, the difference between understanding something for the first time and finally believing something you'd known for a while. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of healing, which is to say slowly and with occasional setbacks. Vale's company went into territorial management within the month. The assets were sold, the ledgers were opened, and the mining companies that had been shorted received a portion of what they were owed. It wasn't everything. It never was. But it was documented, formal, and permanent. The 2 men who had burned North Fork were identified by name. Lucan gave their names twice, once to the territorial official and once in writing. Signed. They were arrested before the end of May. Lucan received a reduced sentence because of his cooperation and because he had freed Tomas and sent the warning to Eli when it mattered. He was not freed from consequences. He had asked for nothing for himself, and no one offered it lightly. His younger sister came to Mercy Gap on a Tuesday in June, and Addie met her at the road with a room and a hot meal, because that was what Addie did. Tomas established a new route that didn't touch any road Vale had controlled. He trained 3 men to run it by midsummer. Eli became Mercy, Gap's paid signal and telegraph runner, a job he took with the gravity of someone who understood exactly how much a warning signal could matter. Dr. Hale held clinic at what remained of North Fork's foundation once a month, under a canvas shelter, until there was a building again to hold it in. Owen Calder's name went onto Mercy Gap's memorial beside the other people from the avalanche. The ceremony was small, and the day was clear, and Rafe stood through it without speaking. Mara stood beside him. She did not touch his arm or try to fill the space with anything. She was just there, which was what the moment needed. Rafe's horses came back. Most of them, 11 of the 12, were found in Vale's holding yard and returned through the asset settlement process. The 12th had been sold, and he received compensation that was close enough to fair. The Oregon contract came back too. Different wording, same route, better terms. The contractor had heard what happened at Mercy Gap, the way news moved through freight country, and he'd sent the offer in writing with a note that said he respected a man who stood his ground. Rafe left the letter on the table in Addie's front room for 2 days without answering it. On the 3rd day, Mara came in from working on the North Fork site plans and found him reading it again. She sat down across from him and waited. He set the letter down. "You think I should take it?" He looked at the letter. "I had it before the bridge, before any of it." She hadn't known that. She kept her face still and waited. "I didn't answer it because I wanted to make the choice after," he said. "Not during. Not while the town was in danger, and Tomas was missing. And you were." He stopped. "I didn't want there to be any version of this where you thought I stayed because I owed you something, or because I'd already missed my chance to leave." She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the slate. "You stayed after the danger was over." "Yes. And you're still here." "Yes," she wrote. "Then tell me what you want. Not what you owe. Not what Owen would have chosen, what you want." He folded the letter. "I want to stay." He said it plainly the way he said things when he'd done the thinking and arrived somewhere solid. "I want to put my horses at North Fork. I want to be there when the first snow comes. I want to be the person who fixes the roof next time, not because you need me to, but because it's my roof too." He looked at her directly. "If that's something you want." She considered him for a long moment, not hesitating reading. She had spent 3 years learning to read the difference between what people said and what they meant. And what Rafe Calder meant was in the steadiness of his voice and the way he had asked it as a question. She wrote, "North Fork is my work. Every decision about that station is made together." "I agree to that," she wrote. "And you'll learn to repair the roof correctly. Not the way you did it in March." "I have all fall to practice," she wrote. "You have the rest of your life to practice." He was quiet. Then, quietly, "Yes." She put the slate down, and he reached across the table, and she let him take her hand. There was no wedding that summer. There was no ceremony, no formal arrangement, no particular afternoon that they decided was the moment. There was a shared life that started accumulating his horses in the lean-to beside her signal equipment, his coat on the hook beside her blue one, his handwriting in the margins of her weather records, where he'd begun to learn her notation system and left questions in pencil for her to answer. He brought Owen's compass back to North Fork. He cleaned it, polished the case, and set it on the shelf above the new signal equipment. She found him looking at it one evening in September, when the first cold came back to the upper mountain, and the air had that particular sharp smell that meant winter was thinking about returning. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the compass for a while. She wrote on the slate, "He would have liked this." North Fork rebuilt. The station running, he would have liked you, Rafe said. I told you that in the beginning. She raised an eyebrow. I was right. She erased the slate and wrote, You were right about the roof, too. Eventually, he looked at her. I was right about the roof on the first attempt. She gave him the look that meant they both knew better. The first real snow came on a Thursday, in late October, early in the day, soft and steady. Mara sat at the table, updating her records, while Rafe worked on a harness near the stove. One of his horses had pulled a trace that morning, and he'd taken the whole thing apart to check the stitching. Outside, the mountain settled into itself. A lantern burned in the window, visible from the lower road. Not a distress signal, not a code, just light. The way a working station held light, steady and readable from a long distance. A traveler came up the North Fork Road in the early afternoon. His horse was tired, and he was reading the sky with the expression of someone who had misjudged the weather. And knew it, he saw the lantern. He turned his horse toward the station. Mara heard the bell ring from the signal post just once, just the single note Eli used for an arriving traveler, and she marked her weather entry, stood, and went to put more wood on the fire. Rafe looked up from the harness. She signed traveler coming. He nodded and got the second chair pulled to the table without being asked. Outside, the cracked copper bell rang once more across the valley. Still imperfect. Still audible for miles. Still enough. There's an old saying out on the frontier. The loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. Cormac Vale understood that better than most. He built his empire on noise, on public performances of generosity, on the warm handshake and the patient smile, on making people feel like his cruelty was simply the weather, something nobody caused and nobody could stop. He was wrong about one thing, though. He thought silence was weakness. He spent 3 years watching Mara Voss work her signal station alone on that mountain, and he never once understood what he was actually looking at. What he was looking at was someone who had learned to speak in a language more precise than words. 3 winters of weather records. Rope knots her father taught her. 8 stitches, tight and even. A whistle lifted from a sleeping guard's pocket over the course of 10 patient minutes. Mara didn't need a voice to lead. She needed accuracy, and she had it in abundance. Every decision she made on that ridge came from knowledge she had built herself, day by day, season by season, in a place where nobody was watching, and nobody was rewarding her for it. That is the first thing this story asks you to sit with. The work you do when no one is watching is the work that saves everything when it matters. The second thing is harder. Rafe Calder came to North Fork carrying grief the way a lot of people carry it, like a compass he was using to navigate toward revenge. He told himself he needed answers about Owen. That was true. But the answers he was really looking for weren't on that mountain. They were in the understanding that love does not require you to die proving it. Owen made his choice freely, deliberately, with clear eyes. He pushed Mara into that hollow in the rock, not because he had failed to find another option, but because he had found the only option that saved someone else's life. Rafe spent 3 years believing his brother's death was a debt he owed the world. It wasn't. It was a gift Owen gave, because he was exactly that kind of man. Learning the difference between honoring someone and punishing yourself in their name, that is not a small thing. That is the kind of understanding that takes years to arrive at, and most people never get there at all. The third thing this story carries is something about trust and its limits. Mara withheld the truth from Rafe. For a reason she could articulate clearly, she knew what he would do with it, and she knew it would get him killed. She was right. She was also wrong, because Rafe deserved to know what his brother's final words were, and the longer she carried it alone, the heavier it became for both of them. There's a version of protection that quietly becomes control, and Mara had the honesty to recognize it. She told him when she was ready, not when it was safe, and the distinction matters. Telling the truth costs something. Keeping it costs more, and the interest compounds. And then there is Lucan. People are complicated in the way that frontier country is complicated, not simply good or bad, but layered, weathered, full of decisions made under pressure that don't wash off easy. Lucan Price helped Vale for years. He carried messages and kept silence and looked the other way when looking away was comfortable. When the moment came, he chose differently, not cleanly, not without cost, but he chose. Mara told him that it counted for something, and she was right. And she was also precise about what it counted for: not absolution, not a clean slate, but a step in the right direction taken by someone who finally stopped waiting for a better time. There is no better time. There is only the choice in front of you and what you decide to do with it. What this story is really about, underneath the blizzards and the blasting cord and the burning signal tower, is the question of what you build when everything you had before is gone. Mara lost her father. She lost her voice before that. She lost 60 feet of snowpack's worth of people she knew. She lost her station, 3 years of daily records. The roof Rafe had just repaired. She stood in the smoke, and she counted what remained. The bell, 3 journals, the lantern code box, the horses, the rope on her saddle. She made herself stop cataloging the losses and start cataloging the resources, because grief was something you did later, and right now you counted what you had. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent any real persons or historical incidents. Viewer discretion